welcome to one of our invasive species citizen science trainings that we're doing with the Upper Sugar River Watershed Association. My name is Matt Wallrath. I work as the invasive species project coordinator at, we'll call it Upper Sugar. That's what we kind of call ourselves, and my contact information is there if you would like to get a hold of me to either report invasive species and also to do volunteer work. And our website is listed right below that, uppersugar.org. So as I was mentioning, we're going to have a few different components of this webinar, and we'll take a moment to ask for questions after each component goes through. So I'm going to give a brief outline of why invasive species are a problem, how we treat them in the state. Then I'll talk about two species in particular this evening. The first will be Japanese knotweed, and the second will be purple loosestrife. After that, I'll go through some tools for reporting those yourself and also how to do that with DNR and with Upper Sugar. I'll also talk about a control page through UW extensions if you have questions about how to do this in your own backyard. And we'll take a final minute for questions at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, let's get going. This is our official statute of what an invasive species is in the state. A non-indigenous species whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So that's kind of a lot of gobbledygook of big words. But what it really comes down to is a bunch of things like this that you see in this slide here. So when we're talking about invasive stuff, we're talking about things that are going to be not just something that's a pest or something that is, that we think is unpleasant, but has impactful interactions with our economy and with the ecology of Wisconsin. So you can see some of them listed here. And the two that we're talking about, Japanese knotweed and purple loosestrife, definitely do this sort of thing, and that they can crowd out other wanted native species and cause erosion issues, it cause pastures to be taken up. One of my favorite new ideas about this is a book by Doug Talmaney called Bringing Nature Home. And it's all about how you can really see a big impact when you have these keystone native species that we're used to having in our backyards and in our forests and swamps and wetlands and in our rivers, and how those can carry only 5% of that biodiversity carries a huge amount of the ecosystem services that come with working with our native food webs and the ecology thereof. So by having invasive species replace those, it means that our bugs and birds and fish and other related ecological allies out there don't have as much space to do what they want to do in a natural environment. And so that's really, that crowding out of our native species can be a big issue, as well as some actual toxins. So one that we're not going to cover in depth, but you might think of as one of the biggest issues when we're talking about invasive species is this guy right here, which is wild parsnip. Now it's a browned out seed head, but in its flowering season, this thing will cause bad parsnip burns on your arms. So something you really want to make sure you avoid when you're out in the wilderness. So they can be expensive, they can be damaging, and they can actually even hurt the ecology of the area too. So we have a rule here that when I'm talking about these particular invasive species, it's called NR40, and it's a classification that talks about the ways that it gives formal definition to what an invasive species is, including best management practices that can be enacted to control them. So this is something that if you're curious about what we consider a legal invasive species, you can go to this list, and it's on the, it's this formal documents there. The DNR does all this in updated code revision. So who is the one that is deciding for us what we're going to be talking about for invasive species? So I said earlier that it comes into people having there's a threat to the ecology or the environmental ecology, and also to the economics of Wisconsin. And another way that we talk about this is things that are sort of here before the time of settlement. are going to be our native species, and things that were here after, like, you know, the 1800s when people were colonizing Wisconsin, when I guess the you know, German Norwegians, the Europeans were colonizing Wisconsin. Things that existed before that time are considered native, and after that are considered to be exotic. Now, just because they're exotic does not mean that they're necessarily considered invasive. We reserve that idea of invasive species for things that are going to be that economically harmful status. So we've got expert biologists that look at these species and how they spread throughout the state and neighboring states and neighboring similar ecosystems and make that classification. And really quickly, we do have two categories for how we consider these things. This one is the restricted category, and both the species we're talking about in depth tonight are in the restricted category. They are going to be something that is pretty common out there, and that's why we want you guys to know what they look like on the landscape so they can be easily reported. And they are likely not ever to be totally eradicated from the state, but we do want to report them as much as possible so we can know where they are, and we can focus our energy on not spreading them, and also so people don't buy them and sell them and move them around the state unnecessarily. That's compared to our prohibited species category, which the difference here is that if you have these on your land, you are not allowed to possess them. So the DNR would like you to destroy them mandatorily. So they can't be moved around or bought and sold just like the restricted species, but they have this extra category that cannot be possessed at all. And these are the species that are not very widespread yet in the state. Therefore, we have a chance to control and eradicate them before they become very widespread. It gets even more complicated when you have some split listed species. So for example, this is Phragmites that is going to be restricted on the east part of the state where it's pretty common, but prohibited on the west side where it's not yet common. And you can see there's a line down the middle that kind of marks that frontier. So a way that we at Upper Sugar will focus our work is to work on prohibited species as much as possible in accordance with the DNR in trying to make sure that our efforts are being as effective as possible to nip things in the bud. An ounce of prevention really is worth a pound of cure when it comes to doing this kind of work. So that's the brief outline, and maybe you guys are already familiar with invasive species, but I'd like to give that as a heads up so when people know. Invasive does not mean just exotic or not from Wisconsin. It means they're also going to be harmful to the health of the state. Let's get into our two target species for today. So here's a picture of our first focus, Japanese knotweed. The reason I picked Japanese knotweed for this presentation is because it's flowering right now, and it's at full vigor and full height. It's a really great time to see this species in bloom and taking over our wetlands and the sides of our roadways. So this is a restricted species, meaning, as I mentioned before, it's pretty widespread. However, it can be a real nuisance and something that I would love more citizens to be able to ID quickly in their own garden, or if they were to see a small infestation along the side of a river. A little bit of work going into controlling this stuff before it becomes a massive patch can go a long, long way. So you're noticing this stuff. For scale, this can be up to 15 feet tall. And I'm going to get into a little bit more of the botanical details here. I'm not going to read this, but this is a great website if you're ever looking into really geeky botanical ways of looking at species. Go to minnesotawildflowers.info. It's a wonderful page. So that's where I took this screenshot of, and this has all of our characteristics that are going to help you ID this. This is a picture of that I collected just recently out in the wilderness on the side of a road, and that's so you can see that these flowers are starting to form, and they make those kind of showy sprays of cream flowers off the top of these zigzagging branches. They've got an oval to egg-shaped leaf, and on the bottom they look like bamboo. So you can see the shoots on the very bottom here look a bit like, almost like red asparagus coming out of the ground, while the more mature stems have this node-like appearance, like a bamboo, except they're not nearly as tough as bamboo. They're much more easy to break off in your hand, and they're hollow on the inside. And that's how this plant likes to spread. So in general, Japanese knotweed is not very viable when it comes to making seeds. So it's a great time to ID it because of the flowers forming. However, it spreads by rhizomes, by its main technique. So as you can see, a rhizome, which is an underground root, can go up to 50 feet in any direction. And these rhizomes lack root hairs, meaning that they can pierce through lots of different types of things, and they don't really fix the soil. Usually when you pull if you think about pulling a claw, like a tree out of the ground, you get all that soil hanging on, almost an invisible web that is part of what fixes our riverbanks and our forests together so they don't wash away. Knotweed, what it does is it forms these big monotypic stands, meaning just one plant. It also exhibits chemicals that will fight other types of plants. So it actually can be negative to. I'm gonna go ahead and mute some people here. It could actually have a. It can fight our native plants by poisoning them from the roots. So here's a picture of that I took. This stuff often spreads. So here's a thick stand that I took out. Now it's actually quite a lovely plant. This plant, in fact, both of these plants were originally brought here by people doing ornamental landscaping. This shot out on the left side is from around Spring Green along the side of a highway. And Frank Lloyd Wright himself liked this plant and used it at Taliesin as part of his landscaping plan. You see a great picture up here in the upper right of these showy white flowers coming off the top, the zigzagging symmetry. It is a pretty plant. It's also almost impossible to eradicate. So if you're a landscaper, I used to own a landscape business, if you can plant a plant that you can't kill, even if you try, it can be a win for the client until you realize that it's taking over their entire yard. So because of its ability to spread, any one of those little stems that snap off and get caught in, say, a mow deck or in fill for moving utility lines around, those can spread and start a whole new population. Also, when you dig this stuff out of the ground, if you don't get every last bit of root, even a 2-inch section of root left in the ground can spawn an entire new cloned population. So it can be a real nuisance to try to totally eradicate this stuff. It definitely is something that mechanical control is very challenging, not necessarily recommended. You're going to have to go, and the best way to do it, and I'll talk more about resources for this, is to unfortunately use herbicides once you get to a large situation. It can also be at a small scale, dug out of the ground and put into bags, but do not put this in your compost because it will form new colonies. What it likes to do also is cause flooding. That's one of the big reasons we talk about this as a nuisance to our wetlands and river systems. Because, as I mentioned, it doesn't fix the soil the same way as most other plants, those root balls will kill everything else around them by sending up chemicals into the ground, 16-foot, 15-foot vegetation every year. And then when a big flood event comes by, there aren't those other plants to fix the soil, and they wash away. And those root balls will move down the river or down the wetland, get caught in another snag, and that's where a whole other population will grow. So they're cloners. That's how they get around the state. So now a little bit more about how to ID these things in their various forms. These knotweed leaves are what are called simple. So there's one leaf, not leaflets. When they're young, they have kind of this arrow shape, and again, they're this reddish color. The initial stalks look like young asparagus, and they are edible when they're young, though they are high in oxalic acid, so you don't want to eat too much of them in any given time. And they have this alternate arrangement with pointed tips, sort of a flattened base. And again, quite attractive. They all have a reddish stem at certain times of the year, but that's not always the case. It gets a little more complicated because while I'm focusing on Japanese knotweed, there are other knotweed species that we're concerned about. We have native knotweeds as well, but there's other invasive knotweeds. So here's a slide that shows some of the others that are out there. They're all going to have that same creamy white flower coming off the top of the stem. So that's a characteristic. They're flowering right now. It's a great time to ID them. So you can see there's Japanese, which has these smaller leaves. Then there's the giant knotweed, which it's much taller, up to 20 feet tall, and has these very much more heart-shaped leaves. And then Bohemian is a cross between the two. However, because any one of these plants can show a high degree of polymorphism, which means that they can look different based upon how much sunlight they're getting. If you can ID it just to knotweed, that's good enough, and we want to report that either way. It doesn't really matter. They're all treated the same way, and they all have the same flowers. They're all cloned themselves. We don't currently have Himalayan in the state, but it has much more of a lance-shaped leaf. So if you think you have one of these, it's a knotweed, and you can report it no matter what. This is just a slide here that illustrates a little bit more about it's kind of the threat of knotweed. So here's a picture I took in the spring. You can see last year's canes, these zigzag kind of reddish brown canes, bamboo-like in appearance, hanging on from the year before while the young sprout up around it. This is right along a utility line, and very likely this was moved here when this power pole was established. And what I often see out in the countryside is if there's one side of the highway that has this stuff, it keeps moving bit by bit down the entire side of the highway. A message to you out there, again, if you're a utility person or if you're a landowner and you work with this, you notice this stuff, you have to clean your gear off after you mow this stuff. So mowing it, it's just going to knock it down. It's not going to kill it. And fragments of this, if they get caught in your machine and move to another part of your property, can pretty easily become a whole infestation. So please clean your gear off and know this when you see it. Upper right-hand corner here is a picture of knotweed when it's young, busting right through asphalt. This stuff is so serious that it can punch through concrete and asphalt. Bottom right picture is a picture of it infiltrating inside somebody's house. So it'll actually punch through people's walls in their foundation, find cracks, and get inside your house. It can be quite destructive. So to the point where in the UK, which this is not on the left, but this is a picture of a backyard that's completely taken over by knotweed. In the UK, the insurance companies and banks are taking note of it and will, if there's an infestation at your house, will note it, and it's actually treated as living hazardous waste, and you have to remove it before, otherwise it's noted on your property when you're selling your house. And this is a picture I took again of as it spreads along the roadside. You can see where it pops up along the edge where it's mowed back, but it keeps coming back and coming back. So this is right at the same area, and it just keeps on cascading and spreading slowly along the sides of the roads. So quickly, as we're talking about flowers, as we're talking about flowers, we do have a native lookalike that I often get people asking me about as they are concerned, and they say, oh yeah, it's pretty tall, it's growing up, it looks like it's something that's taken over the side of a highway. They say, oh yeah, I've seen that stuff. Don't confuse it with our wild cucumber. If you notice this on the right, this flowery, these sprays of creamy white flowers are very similar, but wild cucumber has this star-shaped leaf. So compare and contrast between these heart-shaped leaves and the tall stalks coming out of the ground versus a climbing vine. So don't panic. On your way up to Stevens Point, if you're driving along the side of the highway and you see huge amounts of spruce trees being covered by a climbing vine, that's not knotweed, that's just our native wild cucumber. So I'll pause here for a moment and see if anybody has any questions about knotweed in particular. Again, I'll talk more about control resources and things like that at the end, but if anyone has any questions, I'll take them now. So looks like not. So if anything pops up, you can go ahead and raise your hand, or there's also a chat function that you can find and type questions into chat. So Let's move on to our second species of concern for our focus today, which is purple loosestrife. Purple loosestrife is once again a I had a question. Do other states have this invasive species of plant? Yes. Thanks for the question. It's widespread throughout the region. It's really focused. The West Coast and river areas has a bunch of this, and it's spreading throughout the entire Midwest. Definitely is in Minnesota and Michigan and down in Illinois. It's underreported, and it's a serious threat. So it's something that you can check. I've got some resources at the end that I'm happy to share with you as far as ways you can get on different databases to check out occurrences that people are reporting their citizens are reporting, as well as other groups are reporting this stuff. So it's pretty widespread. It is originally from Asia, as you might suspect, probably a cultivated variety that's really vigorous and quite beautiful. So in the trade, so it's been used as an ornamental species for a long time. So it is all around the United States and around the world. Okay, thanks for the question. Okay, moving on to purple loosestrife. It's a beautiful plant, also brought here by the ornamental trade. Has these characteristic 6 flower petals on long stalks, and it has this very showy, very tall spikes of flowers that kind of go off like a reverse firecracker, I like to say. So you can kind of see in this picture how the bottom blooms and they work their way up slowly through the course of the late summer, mid to late summer, as they bloom and as they kind of crawl up these flower spikes. Quite a lovely plant, pretty hardy, and makes a lot of seeds. So you'll see these things all throughout wetlands. Restricted species, pretty common throughout the region. So something that we are not going to ever eradicate fully, but we do want to report it. And we actually have a special program of biocontrol that I'll get into at the end of the purple loosestrife section of this talk. So, keep moving on to our plant geek slide. If you want to get into the real proper terms here. I'm not going to read this again, but I will mention a couple key characteristics. If you notice this picture on the left, how square and ridged the stem is, that's a key characteristic. I'd also challenge you to learn the difference between a alternate and an opposite way of leafing out. So this is considered a opposite way of leafing out. If you see where the branches are coming off of the main stem and where the leaves are coming off the main stem, they're quite symmetrical. They're opposite each other. So that's a great way to tell. A lot of the other lookalikes are going to be alternate. So when you find this really, it's a knobby, it's textured to your hand. You can visually see these ridges on the outside of the stem. And there's more information here about what the leaves look like. They are tapered, kind of lance looking with a central vein coming down the middle and a bit of a heart-shaped base. And they don't have any stalk coming off the side either. So information, if you want to get really geeky with your hand lens, get out there and count petals or count the stamens in there. Also a good way to go. Again, Minnesota Wildflower is a great resource for getting all of your plant geek needs. Now, the reason this species can be such a nuisance is it's perennial. It comes back year after year. So here we have a picture that I was out in the early spring, and there are seed heads hanging on from last year's growth. So even when it's dead, you'll see these things out in wetlands continuing to grow. This is at Lake Bellevue down in Belleville, and it's definitely so because it can continue to grow year after year, it doesn't die back like you might suspect other plants do, it can be a serious long-term nuisance. So people ask, why is this a problem? Again, I mentioned before, it crowds out native plants. And we have a lot of things here that are used to eating the seeds and the leaves of our native plants, but are not used to eating purple loosestrife. So for that reason, we have brought their own enemy right to them. So these are pictures I took on the bottom left and bottom right that I took in the middle of the spring season. We have brought the Garicella beetle over from Europe. This is originally a species from the Europe area, from the like Germany area, it has a native predator there. Nothing around here eats it very vigorously. However, we have a program in which we raise these beetles. So the little yellow spots you can see in the bottom left are those beetles, the larvae. And they come out, they bore into the side, and they eat them. And on the bottom right, you can see how they kind of will eat down the tops of the plant. And they really make it much more stunted. Well, this stuff can be 4 or 5 feet tall, or even taller sometimes when it's uncontrolled. Once we have a control, we are able to keep it much smaller, keep it from flowering. Not usually eradicate it entirely, but we do a much better job of keeping it into like a non-flowering, non-seeding part of the ecosystem. We do this stuff with volunteers in the spring, so if you're interested in helping us out, we're always looking for people that can host plants or come out and dig in the muck with us, have a good time, and help grow some beetles. It can be a fun science project for classrooms. It can be done socially distant. So drop me an email if that interests you for our volunteer season. Now, a lot of plants have a purple flower. So if you look at our beautiful plant here, it's tall, it's got these vigorous stalks coming out of it. It's really woody, and it's a perennial. There's a whole slew of plants that look similar, and on the bottom right, there's a fact sheet here that I can go ahead and type into the chat when we're taking questions at the end, so if you want to click on any of these things. I'm also happy to send out the PDF of this presentation if you want to follow along with some of these resources. And also, we'll be putting this up on the web, on our webpage at upworksugar.org in the resources category. So if you want to come back to this and check this out at your own pace, you're welcome to do so as well, and get it up by next week. The one thing you most often see right now that's a really, really common lookalike is this blue vervain here on the right. But these are teeny little flowers. They're really small. While the flowers of the purple loosestrife are much larger. So especially when they're side by side, they're easier to tell. They kind of have that same reverse flowering aspect. So you got phlox, you've got Joe Pyeweed. There's lots of purple stuff. We do actually have a native, the winged loosestrife. But by looking at the hardiness of it, the rich stems, and the way that it flowers in particular right now. So some areas are just finishing flowering. It depends upon your climate. A lot of spots are still this beautiful green color, purple color. And if you're in the area and you want to go down and see some purple loosestrife in a big field, go to Lake Bellevue in Belleville, and you'll see a lot of it along the bike trail down there. So again, a great resource here for looking up lookalikes. Now, I know there's a lot of other stuff that we would love to, I'll pause now and see if anyone has in particular questions about purple loosestrife as far as its ecology or how it got here, how to control, not really how to control it, but any questions about this right now? Feel free to type in the chat or unmute yourself. Give it 1 minute here. Don't be shy. So if not, or type them in as you think of them. I'm going to go through a few resources because this is called fall flowers, and so in case, is the purple loosestrife only in wetlands is the question. It does need a wet, it's a wet loving species. So it needs a pretty wet base. You will see it sometimes, it doesn't grow in the water as far as it doesn't actually have its feet soaking wet. So it's along those edges of wetlands most commonly. You won't really see it in spots that are very seasonally dry. It needs to have some good wet areas in order to grow. So it's mostly wetland species. It can get a little terrestrial, a little bit higher, but will not be in the water, will not be on really dry sites. So often along the edges of wetlands, along rivers, and wet ditches as well, along roadsides. For the question. Okay, so with those, I'm going to go through some other resources so say you want to see these things out in the wilderness and you don't have a plant book. Let's go through some ways that you can do that. This is one of my favorites. You can get on your phone. It's called Wisconsin Wildflowers, and it's a wonderful ID resource to do a key. So you can see right here in the actual picture, you'll click through what type of plant it is, the color of the flowers, how many petals it has, the leaf arrangement, and there's other categories as well as far as what time of the year it's flowering, what kind of habitat you found it in. It then narrows that down and shows you a bunch of plants, and then from there, it's pretty easy to ID the plant. So one to install, and it's also available, once it's downloaded, it's available offline. So if you think you got purple loosestrife or maybe a lookalike, look on that purple flower and it'll show you a bunch of pictures, and it also gives you in-depth descriptions of that plant once you're there. So a great resource for that kind of stuff. If you're wondering times that things are going to be out there flowering, I would invite you, and now so I'm going to plug one of our partners, the Wisconsin First Detectors Network. There's a link up there at the top. So they have a number of resources, and so we're talking about fall flowers and when these things are in flower around you. So in this tools section over here, if you click on that, it'll pop up options, and one of those options is the invasive species calendar. So what's cool about this is that it shows you, I know this is a busy slide, but if you see where the pink is where you're going to see mature fruits, yellow is flowers, green is green, and if it's dormant, it's black. And the detectability is on the bottom right. So when there's a full yellow, that means that you're going to see a lot of flowers. So that, like look at garlic mustard, for example, in April and May, you see a lot of that flower. So great guide there. Oopsies. And again, here's that life stage key on the side for how detectable things are. Now, with that in mind, we want to do more than just view them. We would like you to report them in various ways. The most recommended method by me is to use a tool called EdMaps. So EdMaps is here, edmaps.org. And once you create an account, you can report sightings online. And that's going to be a pretty comprehensive list of aspects. You can say how big the spot is, how how long it's been there, upload pictures, and it will be verified by professionals that will then check your pictures and make sure that we've got the right species. And if you'd like to take this online, take this mobile with you, you can also use the Gledden app, which is available for both Google and Apple, for Androids and Apple phones. And once you have this on your phone, you can do stuff in the field, and this allows you to go and report things with a lat long component right there. Really easy to use. Again, uploads to a professional who checks out your observations. And EdMaps also has occurrence reports. So for the person in Illinois who's wondering if they have other spots around for knotweed, they have distribution records there as well. That's a great place for the whole country to see what counties, what states, and even individual points that have been reported by citizens and by professionals that have verified populations of different species. So you can, if you want to go do some geocaching style thing, go out and check them out yourself, see if they're still there. We also serve as a resource here in our area. So I would encourage you, this is me in my natural habitat. So I would encourage you, if you'd like to report the DNR, you can send a photo, the patch, and the GPS coordinates. We'd like to know roughly what we're talking about to invasive species at wisconsin.gov. And you can CC me, that's matt@uppersugar.org, especially if you are in our part of the world. But even if you're not, I can forward that along to another AIS coordinator in the region, and they can get that into the database or go verify it for yourself. So I'm always happy to look at pictures of people, and we have volunteers out there that send me stuff all the time. So with that in mind, we're getting out there, we're doing our work, we're reporting stuff, and I'm going to quickly go to one more resource I want to share with you, which is our fact sheets. So we've got, back to the Wisconsin First Detectors Network. If you go down to fact sheets and ID videos, they have a comprehensive list of our NR40, our regulated species that we can get mechanical, chemical, and cultural control. So a reminder to always clean your boots off after you're in a wetland so you don't spread those heath around, or garlic mustard, purple loosestrife. A reminder to clean your mow deck, especially if you think you've seen knotweed out there. In general, clean tools and clean gear is one of the best ways. That prevention is so huge to stop the spread of these harmful species. So check that out, and you'll find some great research on things that work from a variety of different pathways. And with that, I'd like to thank you for attending and open it up again to a final round of questions. We got about 5 minutes left here for questions until it's 6:45. If you're interested, again, email me at matt@uppersugar.org, and I'm more than happy to share a PDF version of this so you can click through any of the links that I shared on those slides. And this will be available at uppersugar.org in our resources page for viewing at your pleasure or sharing with other people. So we encourage you to do that and to spread, especially this time of year, get stir crazy with staying inside, go take a hike, go ID some plants. And with those apps I sent you as well, it'd be a great way to learn more about the environment while doing good for nature. So thanks again for your attention, and I'd love any more questions before we sign off here today. What I'll do right now too is I'll click through and I can share a few of these links in the chat if you just want to grab them quickly. That way they're right there for you. Get out of this. So we'll go with this one. There's that. Go up to Minnesota wildflowers. Oh, here's the loosestrife fact sheet. And we'll get you the Minnesota wildflowers as well. All right. Oopsies, that's going to. All right. I'm going to stop recording.